heart recognized it first. And then if we want to do the problem solving, you can problem solve at the brain level, which can be very linear sometimes, and sometimes very left brain, or you can allow your emotions to help guide you as well. And this is a little tricky for some people because sometimes we've been damaged and we don't really want to keep that heart open. We kind of shut it down because we want to protect our heart, right? So part of the thing of the breath is to open up the heart. It didn't take much time to figure out that he had trouble reading. And like so many of our youth, who, as they age, as they have trouble reading, rather than let you know that that's their trouble, what do? They create issues and problems, right? They become the class clown. They act out. They shut down. He would fall asleep on his desk. So I actually became a mentor for this student, and we worked together to figure out, wow, what is it he likes?
Welcome everybody. This podcast is all about you. Why knowledge matters. Welcome. I'm Yannick, your host, and now joining me, Dr. Christine Mason, clearly a pioneer when it comes to mindfulness and education. She is an educational psychologist, and now I'm so thrilled to have you back, Christine Mason, on the podcast to really talk about your outstanding work that you have been doing for the past 30-40 years. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me. And I must say, I'm so appreciative of your interest in this work. Schools need to change. Society needs to change. And how do we bring that about? Hopefully with more and more exemplars of what works. And what we suggest in our work, of course, is that we start with ourselves, with our hearts and our minds, and we increase our own capabilities. And that alone can do a lot to relieve the stress that everyone is under.
Yeah, it's so.
Keep going. Let me know.
It is so important. So we will just start and really frame a little bit the question, because what you point out is it is so important today, because given the complexity, given the trauma that is so prevalent in school and beyond, really, and it's really also, I think, this history of humanity, as a whole, right? I mean, we all, based on certain theories, we all somehow, are troubled, right? And so we need support. Some, of course, more than others. And that's where really you come in and really help out in order for us to really increase our awareness. And then ultimately, and that's the most important point, in my view, is you give tangible, actionable steps to actually implement it on the school level. That is what is so important. So please start with trauma and why it is so important to infuse mindfulness into our schools.
Thank you. Well, the recent statistics are that in the U.S., there are about 555,000 students who have been abused in one way or the other. Abuse, neglect. It's 1 out of 4 girls, 1 out of 13 boys. And you can think of all of the reasons for that trauma, right? And neglect. It could be parents that are too busy. It could be parents that weren't adequately parented themselves. So in some ways, they don't have an idea of what to do. And of course, then there's all the pressure, bullying at school, the social media. What else do we find? We find that the students have trouble rebounding, coming back from this trauma. Once it's in their system, it tends just to stay. And if others are like me, which I know they are, what they may want to try to do is push that trauma down don't want to think about it, don't want to look at it. You want to ignore it. You want it to go away. And what happens over a period of time, of course, is it just gets worse and worse. And when I think about trauma today and everything we have to deal with, I'm also thinking of things like chronic absenteeism. And we know that there are lingering effects of COVID, and that chronic absenteeism is one of them. And what we have found is that over the last 4 or 5 years, there has been an increase. You know, one of the statistics I found is that from like 2016, 17, chronic absenteeism, which was being absent 10 days or more from school, was about 18% or 17%. 2022, 23, it rose to 27%, almost doubled. And when I talk to people in districts and states around the country, you know, they don't know what to do. We don't have the resources. You know, there's truancy, but that is such a negative thing to do, to go out and find that someone's truant. And of course, it takes a lot of resources. So when I look at what we're suggesting, it is a model to address all of these traumas and to address other things such as absenteeism. I think it all goes together. And what we want is we want to turn things around. We want to flip things upside down so that the push for academics becomes not a push, but more an inviting atmosphere where we are with students, helping them learn. And by being with them, what we're doing is actually kind of tuning into them instead of expecting them to tune into our classrooms and our rules and our rigidity. So, what we want to try to do is learn a little bit more about them, figure out what makes them tick, and help support them. And I'll give you an example. I can remember in the 90s, I went back and I taught at the middle school level for 3 years. At that point, I'd probably had 15 or 20 years of my career, and I'd been a professor, I'd done some national research, and I wanted to just get closer to students for a while. So I went to an urban school district where there was high gang involvement, and students from 84 different countries came, speaking 50 plus languages. It was a mini UN in a way. And we had diplomats' children, this is right outside of DC, and we had kids living in poverty all together in one environment. We had kids who were on the gifted end of the spectrum, and we had kids with severe emotional problems, not the autism, not to that level, but certainly kids who in the 90s had not been fully integrated into classrooms. Part of my job was to work with seventh graders to see if we could get more of that integration happening. And what I found, and I was just writing about this the other day, it was kind of fun to think back on it, is I was trying to figure out what would make kids tick. You know, where did they get excited? So I started my own private little grid, a little, sheet for myself where I said, hey, what do kids love? And I made, lines across a piece of paper, kids' names, dates, and things we were doing. And I would just look at it and say, hey, I saw somebody really get excited about this activity or that. And when I saw it, I would put a little heart in a square. So I had a heart grid. This is back in the 90s before we had heart-centered learning. Even then, I was focused on what makes kids happy. How could I reach out to them so that we become more engaged, so they feel that they belong? It wasn't the easiest job I've ever had, but it certainly was rewarding. And I will say that we reached many, many kids in the 3 years. I did that for 3 years. So, yes, there are ways to address the trauma, and some of them are very, very practical by tuning into kids. And the book I wrote, which, we're going to be talking about today, is Mindfulness Practices, right? And I wrote it with Michelle Rivers Murphy and Yvette Jackson, two scholars who I was thrilled to work with. Michelle had a background more as a school administrator, but she and I, when we connected, thought, oh, we had such similar experience. She'd worked with youth in gangs down in Florida. She had gone out of her way to try to figure out, what do I do to get kids to want to be in school? And Yvette Jackson, what a rock star. She, at that time, was the associate director or one of the co-directors of the National Urban Alliance out of New York. But before that, she had actually worked heading gifted education in New York City. She would travel the country, and a lot of what she did related to student self-agency, self-determination. And so one of the components we have with the approach we take is figure out what makes kids tick and then give them some agency, right? So that in fact they feel a sense of being valued and they want to engage with us because we care about them. And we show that caring by listening carefully and tuning into them. Just one more quick example from my experience in that middle school. I walked into classrooms, and back in the 90s, I was kind of the special ed resource teacher. We did a lot of floating around. And I thought, okay, I can support any student who needs support in that environment. And some of the kids came from other countries. I remember one youth from Pakistan who was probably pretty high, and his eyes were kind of glossed over, and he wasn't very engaged. And I thought, what can I do? So I walk around, I kind of get down on his level, eye level, right, rather than being up here. And I said, hey, what's going on? Yeah, grunt, complaint. I said, well, I figured out, it didn't take much time to figure out that he had trouble reading. And like so many of our youth, who, as they age, as they have trouble reading, rather than let you know that that's their trouble, what do? They create issues and problems, right? They become the class clown. They act out. They shut down. He would fall asleep on his desk. So I actually became a mentor for this student, and we worked together to figure out, like, wow, what is it he likes? And I think he was just so surprised that someone cared enough to ask him about his life and to try to come up with some assignments that were better matched with his interests. When you think about teaching a subject, and history is a really good one, there are so many ways to teach about, I don't care if it's the Civil War or if it's worldwide history and you're looking at history of other cultures. You can do it by being flat and boring and get into the facts. Or you can realize in this culture, we had kids from 84 countries coming, right? And I bet they knew something about those countries and they could share and they could increase their sense of pride in their country. And all that created to the heart, helped to contribute to the heart we had going on in the schools.
Before we go into the specifics and heart-centered learning, because it's so fascinating what you are actually laying out in the book. But first, I just want to go back a little bit more personal into your career, because one thing is really evident, that you are a very special person. You really embody the change that you want to see in the world, and I think it takes a lot of effort. So give us a little bit a taste of how your journey has been up to today, because it is hard work. That's what
Yep.
my assumption is.
It is. It's hard in one way when you're trying to collaborate with others who don't necessarily want to change and are resistant is very tough. Working with the kids, I never found to be that hard. Through my career, and I started as a professor at a couple universities out west, and what I learned is that with kids, I could teach almost any kid some level related to the topic at hand. And I could teach other teachers how to teach the kid, reaching the kid at some level. It wasn't that hard because you can kind of do this assessment. Oh, yeah, it's too hard, too easy. You can come to the zone of proximity or comfort, of Volotsky's work, and say, we want to find that place where the kid is challenged but not bored. And you can do that and have 20 or 30 things going in the classroom if the kids are working with you, if they're tuning in and want to support you. But I don't know how many times I've had kids come up and say, I'm not going to work for Mr. Smith. No way. And I'm thinking, oh, they're sabotaging themselves because they don't want to support a teacher. So being one with a student is really critical. And think about what that being one with a student might mean. It means that you really try to figure out what their life is like, what works for them, and then how can you tap in and elevate them so that they have a better experience, a more positive experience. So that worked pretty well. And I did that in various ways over a number of years. I was an educational researcher at 2 or 3 national organizations, including the Council for Exceptional Children. I was involved early on with mainstreaming. Well, that's a term from the 70s with IDEA legislation, when in fact, before the 70s, kids who had disabilities weren't always taught in public schools. And many times they were taught in segregated environments. So we got rights for kids. And then we went about trying to help general educators and special educators figure out how to work together. And that was kind of fun and exciting work. It really was. But I was also a single parent at the time, raising a daughter by myself. And those things made it difficult sometimes to fully focus on work or fully focus on being a parent. And, looking back, I wish I knew more about parenting. Probably always a much better educator than I was a parent, frankly. But I've learned a lot, and I'm a better grandparent today. So I think that counts for something. So fast forward a few years, and a grant I was working on at the Council for Exceptional Children ended. And I thought, what am I going to do now? I went to Washington, D.C., and worked with a transition to teaching project. Now, if you know anything about those projects, they're interesting because what you want to do is take someone essentially who can breathe and bring them into the classroom so that they can teach. So an alternative certification program, a research-based program where, in fact, we worked with kids in the lowest performing areas in DC. We worked with charter schools and worked with almost 80% of them establishing mentor teachers. And mentoring is one of these wonderful, wonderful things we can do to help. It can be a gift to schools to have a mentor and to coach the mentors. So how do you get other people to do what you know you can do? That's what the coaching is all about, right? So you get that going, and that's good and fine. And then that project ends, right? So I've lived on grant funding since about the 80s. And then I went to India as part of a yoga thing. So I got involved in yoga along the ways. And I've been teaching like between 2 to 5 yoga and meditation courses a week, no matter what I'm doing, since 2001 when I was certified. I have a daily practice, and all that influences what I do and how I think. And I have yogic tools, I believe, that will help me if I need to calm myself down or if I need to be more alert, if I need to think more clearly, if I need the left and right hemispheres of the brain to work together in a better fashion. I've got tools. So I use those. And as I use those, I help to guide others. So 2009, I established my own business. We do school improvement work in DC and Ohio. And at that point, we did that for about 3 years. One of the schools in DC, just to give you an example, Hospitality High at that time, received an award the first year I was there working with them as the school that made the greatest gains academically of any school in DC. Now, it wasn't all me. It really wasn't. However, I do think I was doing it as observation conferencing approach to help the schools out and guiding their leaders. And that type of coaching, I think, was really, really helpful. But all this sets the stage for when I go to the National Association of Elementary School Principals. I help with their research and professional development. And I start to say, and I'd said this to myself earlier, you need to focus on the leaders. And from the school improvement work I did, which maybe you can remember back to the year 2000 to 2010 in particular, was a time where there was a lot of turnover of school principals. If your school didn't meet certain standards for academic proficiency in a certain length of time, and usually you had about 3 years, they would boot the principal out the door. And there was rapid turnover, which wasn't always mindful or not planned in a good way so that people could know the principal coming in was going to actually do something be better. It was confusing. It was really confusing. So anyway, during that time, I realized we don't always need to focus on the lowest performing schools or the schools most in need. Some of the work we do needs to be focused on the leaders. Those principals and educational leaders that really get it and are doing great things. We want to move the ceiling up, essentially. So since that time, our work has always included a broad spectrum of schools. And we've always said we're supporting leaders, we're elevating them. And just like I work with kids by deciding what works best for them, deciding not myself, conferencing with kids, double checking, trying a few things, piloting. We do the same thing with leaders. And we try to work on boosting their strengths and helping them figure out what their values are, what they could be. Because we like to be kind of a jump, hop, and a skip ahead of the curve. What we want to do is, and I learned this a little bit from yoga too, you want to push yourself a little out of your comfort zone. If we're too comfortable, if we're not challenged, it probably means we're not doing the best job we could. There's so much complexity, so many needs in the world today that what we want to do is help people, help leaders say, what's next? And then how do we get there? And we do that through our mindfulness work. We do that through neuroscience, understanding the brains of the staff and the students, the families, and through visioning, which is another part of my work, to make sure that people vision together. Kind of a long answer. Did I give you an answer?
Yeah, brilliant. I want to tell everyone who is listening now, really get a copy on solutiontree.com. Mindfulness practices. It's really a handbook to change not just your school and your practice, but also really your life. You really lay out all these tangible and actionable steps that are so empowering, in so many ways. So thank you for that. I want to just quickly go back what you have mentioned, and I want to have a little bit your taste. First of all, you mentioned that this heart-centered learning, right, which is so key. But before going to that, I just want to pick up on a point that you made, and you said maybe I was not the best mother, but I think that every adversity has its equal opportunity. And today I'm sure your daughter looks back and actually said, you know what, you were a brilliant mother because you allowed me to really become who I ever wanted to become. I think, what's your take on that? I think you're a little bit tough on yourself.
Oh, I don't want to talk too much about myself. However, yeah, I think that's right. It takes time, and as our adult children, age, they gain understanding about what happens. But I do think it was a very difficult set of circumstances, as many people have. I was raised in an environment where, in fact, I was loved and nurtured. However, there were certainly obstacles I faced, many, many obstacles. And I'm a survivor. Um, and in that trauma that I had, my own trauma, I didn't always recognize the trauma that was there and how that was impacting my decisions. And just like in the book, we talk about flight, freezing, and fighting, how the brain shuts down under trauma. I certainly had some of those experiences. And I'm just grateful that everyone talks about these things today. We have such a wealth of research and knowledge so that if in fact you find yourself slipping into these patterns that, in your own mind, you may say, oh, what's going on here? Take a little time and pause with that and reflect on whether or not trauma is impacting your life. Because if it is, some of our mindfulness tools, our yoga tools, can be very helpful. Of course, we always say see a therapist if you need to, think things through, but also breathe. And I really want to point out that the research base is so strong on focusing on the breath and also focusing on what we can do through meditation. And there's probably almost an equal group of research that says not everybody meditates really easily. It's not easy just to sit there and try to empty your mind. However, if you move around a bit first, which is part of the yoga thing, it's movement with breath. Then when it comes to sitting there and meditating, your system, your neurological system is ready for it. It becomes a more satisfying experience. And we always say, try for 40 days. Don't give up in those first few weeks because you may feel that you're not getting anywhere. And I can remember early on in the first probably 5 or 6 years of meditating, wondering if I was doing it right, and thinking, I don't know what to do. But that's okay because the practice in itself is so valuable. So if you just kind of let go, don't have high expectations for it being in this blissful, realm where in fact nothing can impact you. If you have what we call monkey mind and your mind is jumping around, just go back to your breath. And if you can do these things, then you as a leader, as an individual, can end up feeling more calm, more confident, more assured, and you're likely to make better decisions. In another book I wrote, we talked about vitality. And we wrote this book during COVID. And we said, people are stressed out. And there's all this guidance about what to do about stress. But the flip side of stress is vitality. And there are things, whether it's, good diet, going to bed on time, exercise, nutrition, doing things for yourself, self-care, or breath and yoga. All those things can help increase your sense of well-being and vitality. So if you enter a difficult situation and you're kind of worn down, you've had a stressful day, and the next day is just as stressful, you may not make the best decisions. You believe that under those circumstances. However, if you set aside even 3 minutes for some breath work, maybe take a drink of water so you're hydrated, breathe deeply, then be clear or more clear of the clutter, and the brain operates more efficiently. And that makes a world of difference.
I can tell, and you are the best example. And just, generally speaking, as you said, it's also the movement, right? And so if you really want to relax, I always tell this, then you have to, for example, you can either do yoga or do exercise, because after that you feel better. I had the very first time a depression, maybe 3 years. It was during COVID. Okay, so it was just like simply I screwed completely my back completely, so I had to basically lay down for almost a month. And I grew up always exercising, always going to sports, soccer, hockey, all the things, right? And so what it ultimately did, I realized all of a sudden there's like a cloud. So I was just not, I, I didn't perceive and experience like the beauty around myself anymore as I did before. Because before I was always like smiling when I was walking, the sun and everything. And all of a sudden this was gone. So it was really, really bizarre. And ultimately what I did I went to a, doctor, and ultimately, he made the diagnosis, and I got some, luckily, like chemicals, who really helped me out to rebalance my chemicals. And obviously, with sport and everything, but it took almost 2 months really to rebalance it. And it was scary because I was like, it can't be like, before I always thought, how can you get a depression? I really don't get it, because obviously I never experienced it, right? And so this was ultimately a blessing. But just to your point, it's so crucial, it's just one way or another, you gotta really make your body move, right, and get your energy going. And just to the other point that you also mentioned is like time, right? And you really brilliantly laid out how important it is to invest in a student's time, right, to get him to know, even though like it's more and more complex in the sense of now people are included in all the different classrooms. But this is also the beauty, because it's just a matter of really acquiring the knowledge, the strategies, and the tools to actually accommodate all these different students. And ultimately the joy of teaching just increases, right? So this is just as a side note. But now I really want to go into the nitty gritty, because your heart centered learning is so crucial. Now, first, really tell us what's the relationship between the heart and mind and brain, and if it you according to you it's different between brain or mind or not.
Um, so some people will say that the brain is the physical organ in the head, the body. That's the brain. And the mind is what's going on, the functionality. And the mind can influence your emotions, right? And your actions. Whereas the brain, again, is that physical mechanism. It's where the neurons and the synapses are working and information is coming and going. Okay. So we talk about a heart-mind connection. And did you know there's a vagus nerve that goes all the way from the gut, and it's the largest nerve in the body, and it meanders all the way up to the brain and probably to the hypothalamus area of the brain, okay? And the importance of that nerve is so critical, because if you have good vagal strength and tone, then there's going to be a good relationship between what happens in your heart, your emotions, your feelings, and your brain. And there's some research that says, and you can think about this yourself, that sometimes we intuit things kind of at the heart level before we become consciously aware. So you've probably walked into a room and seen a loved one sobbing or upset. And even before words come to you to describe what's going on, you may feel a tug at your heart. The heart recognized it first. And then if we want to do the problem solving, you can problem solve at the brain level, which can be very linear sometimes, and sometimes very left brain, or you can allow your emotions to help guide you as well. And this is a little tricky for some people, because sometimes we've been damaged and we don't really want to keep that heart open. We kind of shut it down because we want to protect our heart, right? So part of the thing of the breath is to open up the heart. And if you want to do this with me, I have a little heart beaming exercise that I teach. It's pretty simple. You put the left hand on the heart, the right hand is over the left. You can close your eyes or lower your gaze. And then we have something called deep belly breathing, which we do in yoga. So we're going to do this. We're going to breathe deep into the belly, expanding it like a balloon, and suspending the breath. So it's kind of a slow breath. And then on the exhale, pulling the navel point back to the spine, and then holding the breath out. We're going to do this breath 3 times. So that was the first. Second, inhale into the abs. Suspend the breath. Be aware of what's happening at your heart. Feel the warmth. Exhale, navel point to the spine. Hold the breath out. And one more, just inhale into the heart. Feel the warmth. Suspend the breath. And exhale, pulling the navel point to the spine and holding the breath out. Now that's a deep yogic breath. Keep your eyes closed. We're just going to do a couple more things. Breathe at kind of a slow rate. Doesn't have to be quite as slow as we did, but it's up to you. Now really focus at your heart. Feel that warmth of the heart coming to your hands. Then in your imagination, your mind's eye, at a distance, imagine someone or something you love. Could be a pet, friend, family member. When I did this just now, my lips started to curl up, so I started to smile automatically. Keep that person in your focus. Now imagine sending energy from your heart to your friend's heart, to your colleague's heart. And then imagine them beaming that energy right back to you. Feel the warmth. And then inhale and exhale and open your eyes. Now we could go on with that. You could do that several times. We have a little book called Heart Beaming. It's the first book we put out in this kind of yoga mindfulness series. And it's only short, 20 pages. And that's one of the exercises. But this is part of our signature work.
It's just
And how
beautiful.
did that feel?
It's just outstanding how it really changes how you feel, how you feel like connected to yourself, but deeply to your heart, and just how you perceive everything around you. It just everything gets so much more um, bold and lively, and really there is something you can describe it as a joy, just this connectedness to really life itself, to everything there is. So just this short assignment that I just did now with you, we didn't even plan it at all. It's just yeah, it's unbelievable.
Good,
Unbelievable.
good. Well, there is some research again that shows that this heart-mind connection is really critical. And by focusing on your breath, movement, exercise, or even singing or humming, and we'll do this one too. You just hum with me. Or chanting. We could chant things like peace,
Peace, love,
life,
life.
all of that can
Beautiful.
strengthen the vagal tone. Yeah.
Amazing.
And with that, when I first started this chanting, which I do with this yoga I teach,
That's
I
amazing.
realized my body is an instrument. It's almost like a cello. I could feel that resonating in my body. I never had felt that vibration before. I wasn't that aware of the capacity for connecting with energy within your body.
It's
And it's fun,
unbelievable. It's
right?
unbelievable. Yeah, I mean, just I did this the very first time, really, And so it's mind blowing. So I will really use this like from now on. It's like, and already, I mean, I read the book, so many of your work actually, and I constantly integrate this, in my school, in my practice, into my worksheets. It's just it's really changing, and really also into my daily life. There's so many things that I already incorporate, that really, tangible. It's tangible. You can really feel it, and it's just exciting. That's really what it is, right? As you mentioned, it's really the journey, right? That really matters, and the growth. And that's where really ultimately happiness really comes, and this joy of learning and really living, because there's no difference.
No, I want you to think through, and over the next few weeks, when you come to a place where you've got a difficult decision or some frustration, think about what your answer would be or your solution, and then do the heart beaming and see if you get a shift. And what I've learned to do, there's 2 or 3 things I do. Some are more complex than this, but this is one of them, is to turn. Instead of trying to overthink, problem solve, or just talk to somebody, I will first try to do the heart work. And physiologically, by putting your hands on your heart, you get a deeper connection, you get more energy, more flow. So if we want to shift what's happening in schools and how we respond to kids in trauma, how kids respond to each other, we could all learn to do this.
That is mind blowing, really. Just this, what you just mentioned, like it's just so powerful. Like you just gave me some really new tools that I can easily integrate. And what you're saying, like with this beaming, and I can't wait to read your book actually, that you just mentioned. You also mentioned it in the book, but I haven't. I have to be honest, I haven't read it yet, but I will definitely do it. Now, I'm really appreciative to you that you mentioned that at some point, right, with trauma and so on, we shut down this really perception, and you call it basically consciousness. It's the center of consciousness to some extent, like a mechanism, as you were mentioning, in the brain, but from the heart, right? And you also citing research from really the Moffat Institute, right? And so there, really, they laid out like that the heart sends signals first to the brain, and it's not actually the brain who tells the heart. And you mentioning this in the book, so it's so powerful, and it's really rigorous science behind that.
They do EKGs, they do measures of saliva. There's something that is called coherence, which looks at the type of heartbeat and the range of the heartbeats. All those measures can shift when you shift your awareness. And they've measured coherence between my heart and your heart. I'll walk into the room, and if I know you and like you, my heart is going to respond differently to you than if you're a stranger or somebody where I've had some tension in the past. It's fascinating work. And all of it says is that we think we're so smart with our brains, right? Particularly in Western civilization. You get all your advanced degrees, you do all that learning, and then, wow, we can go out and, impact others with our learning. What about the heart, right? How can you impact others with your heart? And some of it is so simple. It doesn't cost anything, right? Don't have to get fancy equipment. It's all right here in the body. The breath is the same way. And I mean, what would it take? You're teaching a class and the kids are starting to get fatigued and bored. And you see it, right? They start to squirm. And then if you're not careful, there will be something disruptive that happens. Somebody will yell out to another student. They'll throw a pencil across the room, etc. And then you've got discipline to deal with. On the other hand, if you know that that normally happens about 10:15, right before your 10:30 break, at about 10:10, you could do some yoga, some stretching, some heart beaming, some breath work, and shift the psyche of the students before the disruption happens. Think about that.
Game changer. And you know,
Yeah.
it's yeah, I can't wait actually to really start this also with my students, because I know they are open for those kind of things. It's just a matter how you present it, and it's all about, you know, the start is always a little bit strange, obviously, and you know, but it's just beautiful. And so it will be such a missed opportunity if we don't really apply this on a day-to-day basis, because you know, I mean, we always tell that, you know, education is so important, and what you really are arguing is like, yes, the mind is important, but so is the heart, equally important. And why do you think, what is the rationale that we still do not take the heart as important as the mind? What do you think is the reason for that?
I believe it's probably many reasons, but one of them is if you look at the history of Western civilization, it's much more Western path than an Eastern. Eastern had the yoga, right? Ancient, uh, Kriya's, the ancient works for many, many years. And the West said, oh, you know, we're going to pay attention to the mind. And you go back to the Greek philosophers, right? We're going to elevate the mind, and we're going to make sure that in fact people study and become smarter and smarter. And then as we did that, we would start to compete with others, right? For goods, for land, for territory, you know, and people got into a very competitive mode. And a lot of it was, you know, survival sometimes, but sometimes conquer other nations so that in fact we can grow. And where's the heart in that? You know, have to ask. You're going to go out and slaughter thousands so that you can get, you know, a few more acres of land, right? Um, yeah, too bad we weren't able to get some heart in there. There was probably something, even if we go back to early survival, right? Hunters and gatherers, where in fact there was the alert system that would go off, you know, it might be a bear. And so you learned to process, probably with words at some point, to what to do. Oh, when I feel that way, I'm going to run. And then you learned, you know, to avoid certain areas. And there's so much thinking that goes on. Our brain can kind of trap us at times, right? Because you get so involved in your inner dialogue that you listen to that brain. And of course, some people would say it's the ego too, right? Um, instead of just taking a few deep breaths, trying to look at the bigger holistic picture, the gestalt, and see what our senses would tell us. You know, in the book, we do talk a little bit about a sensory approach to mindfulness. So many people think about mindfulness as the breathing word, but there's also, you know, increasing awareness of, oh, I'm hot, I'm cold. If I go outside and step on the snow without boots on, you know, my feet may get wet and cold. And what does that feel like? Can we imagine it? Can we do a little science experiment? Maybe go out in your socks, go out in boots, go out in shoes that aren't meant for snow. And how do you feel differently? So we can have some fun, teach a little science as we learn about our bodies. If we learn about that, then maybe it's going to be easier to learn about, oh, my stomach's in knots, you know. And again, if people are like me, what I used to do is shove those thoughts away because I didn't know what to do with them. You know, I would get nervous or anxious or upset. And it's like, don't want to deal with that. I've got to be out there in the world, you know. The better thing is to say, oh, my body's telling me something. Honor that body, honor that response, and then reflect on it maybe and say, oh, I realize when I'm around a certain person, I don't feel quite as good. You know, it's not pleasant. And you can learn to avoid or shift the dynamic, and maybe it's partly you, because maybe that other person is responding to something in you. And it could be even that you're feeling shy and the person doesn't understand why you're not more of an extrovert right now. So what do? Maybe you hold them in your thoughts. So this practice of focusing on someone who may be someone who you dislike and just wishing them well, kind of a kindness meditation, right? And uplifting them and saying, what I'm going to do is treat you with kindness. And then you practice that. And if you spend, like I have, 30 or 40 years, 50 years, practicing kindness, now I'm not perfect, right? Just like everyone else, you still have your times when, oops, something gets you. But nonetheless, get yourself back, and it's practice. Because I say, my equilibrium was shifted, my equanimity, my sense of balance shifted. How do I come back to a zero? That point of neutral space. And some of the yogis will talk about the heart too as a neutral space. So we think about it as warm and loving and kind, but yet if you're in a difficult situation, you put your heart there, it can help neutralize the tension. So how about that?
What I really appreciate is you really bridge the gap between basically indigenous science and their method and Western science, right? Indigenous science is really, if it's relational, then it's science. If it's not relational, it's not. Western is like, if it's measurable, it's science. If not, it's not, right? And so therefore, it's so incredible. And you're talking also about like the gestalt, and it reminds me of basically Carl Jung, who has this the unconscious and the conscious, and really to bring those kind together in order to have like this whole self, right? This embodiment of what really life is all about, and the journey, right? Or an indigenous proverb, I think it goes something like, the longest journey is from our mind to our heart, right? And so thank you so much for bringing this up. It is so essential, and I think we still have some ways to go. What do you think right now, where we are at right now when it comes to education and educating the heart?
Yeah. Well, we developed this committee, actually, or initiative called the Coalition for the Future of Education. And you can go to the Center for Educational Improvement, look at our website, and you can see what we've sent to the various administrations. We've sent like 2 documents in the last 5 years. I think they both went to the Biden administration, maybe last 4 years. And it said essentially, when we look at the world and we look at education, what's needed. And we had a group of like 100 people who signed a petition initially to focus on the future of education with us and to name what we believe needs to happen. We'll probably do something like that again with the new administration. But part of what we said is that we need to think about schools as community. We need to have more community building, which means that relationship building, it has to take priority. And then we talk about neuroscience. I know from working with various groups that if I go into a group of teachers and they're struggling with some of their students and they don't know about the neuroscience of trauma, when I talk to them about that, many times their attitudes towards those disruptive students shifts. So instead of blaming the student, which is often what happens, they go, oh my God, what can we do? How can we do it? And we've had groups of fellows who've worked with us who've done things where they establish a program in a school where each student in the school has one adult who's kind of matched. So there's at least one person that student can talk to. And we know again, Bruce Perry's work and other work says one adult, only one adult who cares about a student can make a world of difference. It can help with that student's self-regulation, that student's sense of well-being, because somebody cares. So we work towards those things. What do I think happens next? Well, we need to get ourselves out of the COVID rut, right? We are still dealing with post-COVID and COVID responses. There is still a push for academics first, academics before well-being, which, if you know anything about the neuroscience, doesn't make sense. It is not logical. Because if a student doesn't feel well, if there's this sense of trauma, they are likely to be in a position of flight, freeze, or fight. The hippocampus will be signaling the rest of the brain, alerting the brain to danger. And there will be this feeling of a need to escape. Now, you can easily shift that with breath and mindfulness and caring and student agency, so that you have a student working with you and learning. And the brain works much better, because then the energy will shift to that prefrontal cortex where decision-making occurs. A lot of the judgment occurs. A lot of the learning we talk about occurs in that cortex. So we want smart thinking, right? We want smart schools. So that needs to happen. And then of course, there's all the inequities that are out there. And if you come from a place of compassion towards others, and you think through differences in what we each have, the unfairness of many situations, then you're more likely to do something to create a sense of equity and well-being. Even if it's a small step, it's important to do. And so I think those are going to be 2 or 3 of the main things. Of course, we have AI coming too. So what do we do with artificial intelligence? How do we use it in a way that will be helpful, with good guidelines for students so that they don't get fooled by misinformation? So we have to teach them to be smart consumers and care for the planet, right? I mean, how can we go about caring for each other and doing a really good job if the planet's going down the tube? We're destroying our planet. You know, some of the things we do as human beings are so irrational. They're not in our best interests. And certainly not addressing years ago the climate needs, shoving it someplace else on the back burner, not paying attention, was wrong. And it's created dilemmas for us that we still have to address. Building bridges to other countries, ending the divisiveness here in the United States. How do we build bridges? Community building. And what do we know about community building? We've got lots of research about how to do it. You go in and you listen a lot, right? Show that you care, and then you problem solve. So there's not just listening, so that you can create some creative action to help in places where change is needed. I mean, none of this is rocket science. It's just good sound reasoning. And if you think it through and you say, what would be best in these circumstances? What would I want for my son, my daughter, my family member? How do we help people work together in a way that's more compassionate? If you focus your energy there, you will get change there. If we had pockets of people around the country, around the world, with that focus and intent, we would do more bridge building and we would address more of the problems. At least that's my take on it. And I'm supported by, again, research. But, our Coalition for the Future, we did listening sessions and we problem solved after we got results back about what we wanted to do. And you have to be in it for the long haul. It's not short. It's not short term. You can't teach mindfulness in second grade and drop it in third grade. Doesn't work that way.
It's life, right? It's a really, whenever you want to achieve something, it's about consistency. You have to do it throughout, grade 12, even beyond that, including university, colleges, vocational trainings. It should be mandatory ultimately, because what you're laying out really is that if you address this really mindfulness, then very, very likely, I would say 80 up to 90% of the problems will be solved. I have no doubt, because you change because of this increased awareness. And what it ultimately also does is not just knowing, it's also knowing what you have to do, and you do it because it is consistent of who you truly are, which ultimately comes down to values, right? What's your value system? And if you start living based on your value system, then you are embodied change. I think that was so powerful. Now, conscious about the time, we could have a whole other episode on the severe consequences of COVID and so on, which I hope we have one day. I really do everything to get you back. But now, second last question is just give us a taste why thinking is so important, and why we should be intentional about thinking, because it matters. It is what creates basically all there is to some extent.
Yeah, I want to make sure I heard you correctly. So you're asking me to talk about thinking. Is that right?
Exactly, and why your thoughts are so important, that you should
Oh,
be
okay.
mindful about what you think, because you are
Okay.
practicing kindness, right? That's a form of thinking,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, let's pause for a minute and think. Okay. We'll think about a circumstance. Let's think about what happened in America when, in fact, we made our way west across the United States, right? We invaded Indian territories. We killed buffalo. We slaughtered women and children, right? Now, what kind of thought was going on with that? Okay. I think it was very self centered, and we didn't have much regard for the other. If we had come from another place where, in fact, we thought all people are worthy of love and are equal, our whole Western experience would have been much, much different. So our thoughts got in the way of our heart and our actions. And we were also rewarded by all the people around us who gave us supplies and armies and ammunition. And people congregated together, and mainly it was men. And for the men, there was a sense of Western expansion. Oh, the adventure. What are we going to find? Oh, that's great. Those were the thoughts. But again, if we had other thoughts there that really showed that we cared for others, it would have been different. That's one example of how thinking has impacted us. Here's another one. Let's say I'm in a horrible situation and I dwell on it and I think I can't get out of it. Okay. And let's say maybe my debts are increasing and I'm fighting with my husband and I don't know what to do next. And my thoughts are just there. It's going to be hard to create a good circumstance. And that's a very difficult one, I will say. And it's not going to be mindfulness alone, but there are strategies, there are resources. So if in fact you believe that there's the potential for change, that you believe you're going to encounter someone who's going to help you, you believe you're going to find something online, you believe that in fact something will come to you, and you focused on your actions, protecting yourself, your children, etc., but also on the belief that you're worthy, despite whatever's going on, that, in fact, your life can get better, then the odds are that you are going to walk into some circumstances, you will draw or attract that stuff to you. Now, that's kind of a little bit of the magnetic part of what goes on, I believe, with our thoughts and thought waves. At a simpler level, I just feel cruddy, and I'm focused on how cruddy I'm feeling. And I feel a pain in my toe. And every time I step or I move my foot, I feel that pain in my toe. You know what happens? That pain magnifies. That's where our focus is. On the other hand, if you start to focus on, my left hand feels good, I'm breathing okay, and these good things are happening, all of a sudden that pain in your toe doesn't take on the same significance. So think of your students. You think you're having a horrible year, and you have 20 students that are hard to deal with, and this is just the worst thing ever. It's one way to go. Or you can say, wow, what's going on here? What could I do differently? Me. Where might I find some resources? Who could help me? And I remember when I was teaching 7th grade and I didn't know about Apple computers, I'd always worked on PCs, and I had to teach this remedial technology class. I got students to help me. They helped to set up the class and to help teach it, and it was fine. So who you turn to shifts with a shift in mindset. So there's a few examples.
It's brilliant. And when you tell me this, for me, it's immediately like it comes to my mind is like, okay, if I am happy, if I'm smiling, well, it's very much more likely that the other person will, replicate it, right? It's like, that's just how we do it, because we are really like humans who imitate, right? The basic tenets of the theory of learning is really imitation, observation, imitation, and and you doing it. That's how we have learned, and the scientific evidence there too. And you also, in my view, you alluded also to this in the book, is that the brain value system and the mirror neural system, they're actually interconnected. So whatever we do, it ultimately it shows to our brains that that's also what we value. And when we really think about it, it is really what it is, right? Because otherwise you will not do it, whatever it is, right? And so that's obviously a whole other question, but I'm just so grateful for everything you have done so far, and hopefully will continue doing the next 3, 4, 5 decades. Really, you can do it.
Yeah, mirror neurons is what you were talking about. So if you're smiling, I'm more likely to smile. If I'm grumpy and grouchy and display that, you're more likely to be there. Yeah, I wish I'd known that again. My early years as a parent, I probably would have handled a few things differently instead of having these high expectations and showing dissatisfaction. But, what do? We pick ourselves up from where we are, wherever it is, and self-compassion is important.
Very important.
And then you try to walk the walk as much as you can, right?
And you are
Which you certainly are doing.
No, you're really such a gift. I mean, you're such a gift. The very last question: what makes you feel alive?
Yeah. There are so many things that make me feel alive. Okay. I could step into the bathtub and feel the warmth of the water and feel like, oh God, this is so heavenly. I could sit in a room and meditate. I could take a walk on a brisk morning. All of that. I mean, it's the sensory input. I can be with friends, however, and that is always special. So, particularly after COVID, you remember when we first started seeing people again and congregating together? It's like, oh, and now several years later, we're still doing that. And then discussions like this, right? There is the intellectual part of me that enjoys the philosophy and thinking about and problem solving and being with people who care. There are just so many ways to be alive and to feel such joy because there's just so much around us.
Dr. Christina Mason, thank you so much for being truly a gift. And now just quickly to all the listeners, go on solutiontree.com and grab a copy, order a copy. Mindfulness Practices, published by Solution Tree. Thank you so much, Dr. Christina Mason, for truly being a gift to me and really the world.
Thank you.
Christina Mason. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.d-ykm.com. Meant to make you grow.